Hello again, and what is hip? And welcome to a video that's going to be very nostalgic for me. It's a topic I've wanted to cover for quite a long time, and that is my love of Sega, but specifically the Sega from the mid to late 90s and the very, very early 2000s, and specifically their racing games from that era. I absolutely adore this era of Sega, and I think their racing games really are the epitome and the definition of Sega from the 90s, because you have the gameplay, you have the music, you have the presentation, all of that wrapped into just an amazing package. And it's really an era of Sega that I think is gone. We've seen snippets of this era through maybe like Sonic and Sega All-Star Racing and a couple of titles here and there. But this is really an era of Sega that I don't see anymore, and I don't know if we're going to return to it. I hope we do at some point, but it's an era that's come and gone, and it's an era that I love to revisit all the time. And I really do credit it for getting me into the 90s kind of Sega, the hardcore Sega, the rough Sega, the grimy 90s Sega, as you will. And I just want to start this video off by, I guess, talking about what got me into 90s Sega to begin with. Now, I've mentioned throughout my other videos that the very first Sega console that I really fell in love with was the Sega Saturn. And I absolutely adore that system for so many reasons. It's definitely flawed in many, many ways, but there's so much charm and so much love there. And the game that really started my love of 90s Sega and the wacky just craziness that Sega was none other than Daytona USA. Now this game, if you were to ask me, or if I were to tell somebody what Sega was in the mid to late 90s in one game, I would show them Daytona USA. Yeah, you have Sonic the Hedgehog, but in the mid to late 90s, you didn't really have Sonic the Hedgehog. It was, really, Sega was kind of just experimenting with their arcade stuff. They had a couple of spin-off Sonic titles here and there, but to me, mid to late 90s Sega was all about arcade action, wacky presentation, and funky music, and that's what this game is. This is pure arcade fun right here. And on the Sega Saturn, there are two versions of this game. There was the original Daytona USA, which is very stripped down. The graphics aren't as good. It's definitely a much rougher game, and it was kind of hurried along to get out for the launch of the Sega Saturn. But eventually down the line, they came out with Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. And basically what this did was it added 2 new courses, it added 8 new cars and a bunch of driving perspectives and new music and just a bunch of great stuff. And as soon as you pop Daytona USA in, the very first thing you hear is Isn't that just wonderful? Daytona! I mean, that, as soon as I heard that intro, I was hooked. I was like, I have to get a Sega Saturn, and I have to get Daytona USA. But even though the game is super fun to look at and super fun to listen to, the gameplay is there as well. Yeah, the controls can be a little slippery, but it's so much fun, and it keeps me coming back time and time again. And in the scheme of things, there really is not a whole lot of content here. There's not a whole lot of content in any of these Sega racing games that I have in front of me, but the content that they have is so good and so replayable that it keeps you coming back over and over again. And I mean, that's 90s Sega for you. And right here we have another example of this. This is Sega Sports Sega Rally Championship Edition, or Championship. And this game is wonderful as well. You have the same funky music, the same 90s presentation, the wonderful singing, crazy singing, and you have super fun arcade action. And this game, I personally enjoyed this game a little bit more than Daytona USA. Not for the presentation. I enjoyed the presentation and music more in Daytona USA, but this is more off-road kind of rally car racing. And the controls, in my opinion, are a lot more smooth, a lot more easy to wrap your head around. And it's just super fun. And the graphics, I think the graphics look really good. I love that rough 32-bit polygon graphic stuff that the Sega Saturn does. It's super pleasing to look at, and it's super fun. And there's also an arcade wheel for the Saturn too, and I think these games were compatible with it, although I'm not completely sure. But Sega Rally here, super cheap game. You can get it for like 30-40 bucks. Same with Daytona USA Championship Edition, or Champion Circuit Edition, which I recommend over the original. But these are just two wonderful Sega Saturn games, and these are two Saturn games that really, if I were to keep only a couple of Saturn games, I would keep these two games and maybe one or two others. But these are just such great creations, and there's not a lot of content there, but you're going to want to keep coming back over and over to play these games. And eventually, you know, we moved out of the Saturn era and we went to the Dreamcast era. And the Dreamcast era, in my opinion, was just as good as the Saturn, except it was more refined. You had much prettier graphics, but you still had the funky music, and you still had the funky gameplay and the super fun arcade action that Sega just excelled at during this time. Right here we have Sega GT, a super cheap Dreamcast game. I got this for under $10. I think it was more like $7. And this is a really fun racing game. Now this one is definitely my least favorite of the bunch, and that's strictly because this is aimed to be more of a driving simulator. So it's a little more realistic, slightly less arcadey than the rest here, but it's still just a joy to play. And there's actually a decent amount of content here. There's 22 tracks, and there's 20 event races, and there's a lot of content here. And I enjoyed this more than the original for the first several Gran Turismos. Something about what Sega does with the presentation and adding that slightly unrealistic gameplay to the game, I enjoy it much more, and the music's great. But however, I would say that this is the weakest of the bunch, in my opinion, because it's a little too realistic for me. But it's a super cheap game, and I highly recommend it, because how often do you come across any Sega games nowadays that are under $20? Now, one game that I absolutely adore, this is Sega Rally 2 Championship, and this is, of course, the sequel to the original Sega Rally on the Saturn. This definitely is the superior game. You have tons of courses. You have 16 courses, including 12 originals on the Dreamcast. The other 4 are from the Sega Saturn, I believe. And the graphics are great on this. The gameplay is fun. I've put in several, I remember when I first got this, which was relatively recently, within the past several years. I popped it in and I ended up playing all night. I was playing till like 2 o'clock in the morning because I was having so much fun with this game, and it captures the charm of the original Sega Saturn version perfectly. Is the music is funky? Not quite. I don't think the music is quite as good as the original Sega Saturn version. And there's something about, as I said earlier, that rough Sega Saturn charm, you know, with the graphics. I love it. I like the grittiness of it. But this is a very refined game, and it's a lot of fun. And you can get this one for pretty cheap as well too. I paid $20 for this, and I think that's about for what it goes for. And there's so much content, and it's still got that wacky Sega 90s fun in a much more refined package. So I highly recommend picking this up. This, along with Skies of Arcadia, are my 2 most played Sega Dreamcast games. I absolutely adore this game, and I think you will too. And this is coming from a guy who preferred like kart racers, you know, like Mario Kart and stuff like that. I didn't think that I would enjoy more realistic racing games such as these, but I mean, I was proven wrong. And last but certainly not least is on the 3DS. and it's the Sega racing game that kind of started it all, and that's Outrun. And Outrun was an old Sega arcade game, and what they did was they made a 3D version of it on the Nintendo 3DS. And they did this with quite a few of their games. They came out with 3D versions where it would be in stereoscopic 3D, so it would look 3D while you're playing it. And what more perfect game to do that with than Outrun? You turn it in 3D, and it adds so much depth, and it's like you're driving down a road. And you have the music by Hero, and it's such a great experience. They added some new content. It's super sharp on the 3DS screen as well. It looks fantastic, and I've played many hours of Outrun on the 3DS. In fact, I would almost go as far to say it's my favorite version of Outrun, right next to the arcade. It's hard to beat the original arcade version with the steering wheel and all of that, but it's such a great experience, and it's something you can only get on the 3DS. And unfortunately, now that the eShop is closed, there's not too many ways to get it anymore. I think they came out with a physical collection of Sega 3D Classic games, and I think Outrun is included on that cartridge. I know Japan got a couple more releases of those. If it's not on the American one, it's on the Japanese versions. But it's also just, it's the pinnacle of the 90s Sega arcade racing fun. And I really do think anybody could just pick these up and play them and have a great time and just have a ball with some friends as well. All these are multiplayer. I haven't played these multiplayer yet, but I definitely intend to do that this summer when I head back home to Oregon. That's what I'm going to be doing. But yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to talk about with this video. Just short and sweet, but talk about my love of the 90s racing Sega. You know, it's an era that was so uniquely its own. I mean, you look at that and you're like, that's the 90s, and it's such an enjoyable time. And I still go back and I'll go on YouTube and just listen to the music from these games because they're so fun, they're so happy, and it's really, really great. And it's ultimately what got me into the Sega Saturn and Sega consoles in general. It was Daytona USA of all games. So yeah, that's it. But thank you guys so much for watching. Do you guys have experience with these old Sega racing games? And if you do, do you have any favorites? Did they get you into Sega? Do you have fond memories of them? Do you hate them? Let me know in the comments below. I'd absolutely love to read them. But thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one.